Welcome everyone. Today we continue our series on a non-political view of the global political climate. When we look at election campaigns worldwide and the daily practice of governing, the fundamental question arises, what is actually the best way to govern a country or an organization? Democracy? Leadership by just a few people, aristocracy? Or leadership by one man or one woman? And if democracy is the best way, do wisdom and democracy actually go together? Does democracy really bring out the best in people? Is a wise democracy just an utopia? We believe that wise governance is certainly possible in practice, also in a democracy. We will go into this in more detail today. An exploration of the best form of governance and the role for leaders and managers, those who are led, the people, the citizens, or the co-workers of an organization. Last week we discussed a number of theosophical basic principles that are essential for wise leadership and social improvements. They are universal unity and connectedness, human solidarity regarding the growth possibilities of everyone, and the laws of reincarnation and karma. Madame Blavatsky called these the four links of the golden chain that must bind humanity together into one family, one universal brotherhood, where each lives for all and all for each. And furthermore, we concluded last lecture that life is based on a spiritual hierarchical structure. Today we are going to investigate different forms of government, and in particular democracy, and the question whether a wise democracy is really possible. The lecture will consist of the following three parts. Part 1, exploring insights on democracy. Part 2, how can wisdom govern a state or an organization? And part 3, a wise democracy. We start with part 1, exploring insights on democracy. What is democracy according to current insights? Democracy means government by the people, and it means that the people themselves vote on the laws like in ancient Athens, or that the people choose representatives who make the laws, such as in countries like Belgium, Germany and the Netherlands, by a parliamentary democracy. In a true democracy, the entire population has the highest authority, and the ideal of human equality is assumed. But applying these ideas is often not that simple and has many aspects. For example, the 19th century French philosopher de Tocqueville already stated that equality and freedom are at odds with each other. Too much freedom is at the expense of equality, but the same applies the other way around. Just think of the limited freedom in the Soviet era in the Eastern European countries. De Tocqueville also warned against the tyranny of the majority, because when voting, the majority does not always have the long-term well-being of everyone in the state in mind, and that can lead to oppression of the minority. In addition, there is also the risk that citizens are not given sufficient opportunity to understand why certain laws are being implemented. sufficient attention to consultation in order to create and maintain support, if possible even based on consensus, is therefore essential. That democracy is not the best form of government is proven almost daily worldwide. Many democracies are just as corrupt as dictatorships. There are plenty of examples: Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, etc. To gain more insight, we will look at Plato's ideas on democracy, for his insights are still very much up to date. Question: what forms of government or administration are there according to Plato? As a philosopher, Plato is always focused on truth. He states that above everything we call truth, there is something else. That is the idea of the good as the source of truth. You can think of the boundless principle of life, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. The moment we think we have found all the insights about something, we close ourselves off to a higher truth. But if we assume that there is always more, we remain open to a greater truth and to wonder. And wonder, says Plato, is the first step towards philosophy. According to Plato, it is about having an image of the good within yourself, regardless of circumstances and forms of government, and always trying to live from there. In other words, Plato points at always try to be inspired by your inner higher nature, and thus cultivating high thinking within yourself. And because ideas rule the world, the state of man therefore also determines the state of the country. In his dialogues, Plato gives various reflections on the different forms of government and administration. In the dialogue The Republic, Politeia, the central question is, what is justice? In this dialogue, Socrates proposes not to limit this question to the thinking of one man only, but to first look at what justice in a state entails. So everything is magnified, as it were. First, a soberly organized state is discussed where everyone only needs the basic necessities. This form of government is very simple. It resembles a kind of monastic community where no one has personal property. But then follows the state with more luxury and property. Then it quickly becomes complex. Plato then defines the concept of justice as a state in which everyone fulfills the duty or task for which he is naturally most suited. In Theosophy, we then say that everyone can develop according to his essential characteristic or svabhava, that is, that you become who you essentially are, and that you use your natural talent for the enhancement of the whole. The duty of one is not better or more important than that of the other, but they do differ. After all, the duties of a king are different from those of someone who does practical work or of a scholar. But everyone is needed and no one is excluded. In the complex state, desire thinking plays an important role, causing harmony to disappear and people to experience the contradiction of justice and injustice. Is it possible to find a form of government in which justice reigns. Yes, indeed, Plato states. And he describes it, but also shows how other forms of government arise when this one falls into decline. Plato makes in the dialogue The Republic a distinction between 5 forms of government and ranks them in order of the extent to which the principle of unity and connectedness and harmony of all people and beings increasingly recedes into the background. The decay of the 5 forms of government, according to Plato in the Republic, then looks from high to low as follows. First, we have the aristocracy. This means that the state is governed by the best, the most excellent ones, those who have delivered the best performances philosophically and militarily. In Plato's view, this is the ideal form of government. In the other forms of government, the shortcomings are increasing. Second, we have the timocracy, which is governed by the ambitious man. In this form of government, the philosophical qualities are lost and internal disputes increase. Third, we have the oligarchy. That is the government of the few, of members of the privileged class, sometimes also called the plutocracy. Plutos means wealth, as it is government by the rich. However, Plato does not want wealth to determine a social position. Plato's judgment so far. The timocracy of the military and the oligarchy of the rich can still count on some understanding from Plato. Status and money can certainly provide a certain amount of pleasure, provided that one uses one's common sense and does not blindly strive for the satisfaction of one's material needs and desires. Then subsequently follows, fourth, the democracy, literally meaning government by the people. If the rich oligarchs are overthrown by the people at some point, then a democracy can arise in which the people are leading. Plato makes a comparison with the bee colony that is governed by drones. And just as drones are a plague to the bee colony, the rulers of a democracy are like a plague to society. We will go into more detail about this in a moment. Plato also states that in a democracy there is a focus on having a lot of personal freedom, which means that democracy will eventually lead to tyranny, the 5th and the last form of government, dictatorship, which is ruled by a tyrant. The people give their power to one person and submit to him. This inevitably results in exploitation and slavery. According to the Republic, tyranny is the highest form of immorality. Ethics in societies are lost. Then Plato's judgment. Democracy and dictatorship are not allowed in the Republic. According to Plato, aristocracy is the best form of government. Then, once again, the spotlight on democracy. Plato initially presents democracy as the form of government with the greatest personal freedom. Personal freedom. Everyone is allowed to speak unhindered, and you can do and leave whatever you want. But therein also lies the great risk of democracy, because it will slowly but surely succumb to that insatiable desire for personal freedom, and then degenerate into a dictatorship. Plato foresees a situation in a democracy in which parents want to flatter their children, and the children therefore lose respect for them. Teachers start talking submissively to their students. Young people look down on their elders, and the elders imitate the young in order not to appear authoritarian. Plato states that in such a democracy, three groups will emerge. On the one hand, you get the drones, whom he called the brutal rulers, the people who always have their say, who know how to convince well, and who take political power to themselves. On the other hand, you have the rich, those who, with their wealth, can also exert considerable influence on the third group, the people. According to Plato, a battle will then arise between those brutal rulers on the one hand and the rich on the other hand. The rulers will try to extort as much money as possible from the rich, for example through high taxes, in order to also be able to give something to the people to keep them happy, but of course also for themselves. Please note, compare that with the current situation in the world, where large multinationals, such as industries and tech companies, threaten to leave a country if things, such as tax regulations, turn out unfavorable for them. Now, the rich in the society will try to work against those in power with all kinds of lawsuits to keep their money, so that those in power will be seen in a bad light. The people are the victims of this struggle. In order not to be defeated, the people then choose a strong leader, someone who does not shy away from violence and makes beautiful promises to distribute the money fairly again and to ensure that everyone can participate again. The people go along with this, and as long as this leader, the future tyrant, takes good care of them, they tolerate that. He does not shy away from violence against his opponents. This leader is also constantly looking for conflict, because this gives him the opportunity to eliminate his opponents, and also to make it plausible that it is better that he remains in power. Slowly but surely, the tyrant thus draws all power to himself. At a certain point, he too cannot keep his promises to the people, but he now has all the means of power to get away with it. Ultimately, the people will have to fight with the tyrant to take away his power. There are a striking number of characteristics that Plato mentions that we can recognize. Two examples. An historical example is Romania in 1989, when the Ceausescu couple was overthrown by the Romanian people. As a current example, think of Venezuela. For the time being, the people there are still on the losing end. All in all, it is a rather negative image, but it is a warning that we can benefit from it in this day and age. And of course, Plato described it as a metaphor. And of course, the people themselves play a very important role in this. It is not for nothing that the expression is that the people get the leader they deserve. The conclusion is that Plato does not hold democracy in a very high regard. But in our current democracy, we do of course have the necessary mechanisms that ensure that the state cannot become corrupt too quickly. In almost all democracies, the so-called trias politica is applied. At state level, the trias politica, or threefold separation of powers, is a theory of the state structure in which the state is divided in three bodies that monitor each other's function. The legislative power that draws up laws, in the Netherlands, for instance, the parliament. Then the executive power, the government, that exercises the daily administration of the state according to the current valid legislation. And third, the judicial power, justice, that tests this implementation against the rule of law. This division goes back to the work of the French Enlightenment philosopher de Montesquieu from the 18th century. In this most common form of democracy, it can be prevented that a power-hungry person or group of people can really grow into a dictatorship. But in addition, there are of course other factors that could be involved, such as, for instance, the lobby and influence and power of large multinationals, industries and tech companies. Some of these influences are favorable, others are unfavorable with regard to maintaining the democratic constitutional state. It is also sometimes called the fifth power, these big multinationals. Then we have also the media, and in particular the new online media, also sometimes called the fourth power. A report was recently published by the Scientific Council for Government Policy of the Netherlands, in which the following vision on this subject was set out. In a democracy, the purpose of the media in society is to inform, to monitor power, and to provide a forum for debate. The report gave the following recommendations, including use of European legislation and regulations to realize a reliable and secure information environment. Also to make information important to democracy clearly visible and findable, and to stimulate users to take responsibility for their role and position in the new online media. So much for now of being aware of the risks to a democracy. As for the various forms of government mentioned above, they are not necessarily interesting, but moreover the question is, how can we ensure that wisdom and the right ideals will rule in the state? Because at the level of the citizen, we are, even in a democracy, simply able to take responsibility on the basis of our freedom of thought and conscience, as opposed to striving for the greatest possible personal freedom. Because both Plato and the philosopher de Tocqueville clearly state that it is very important that the desire for personal freedom does not become too great, because otherwise, for democracy, risky processes will occur. Conclusion: democracy literally means government by the people, but that is no guarantee for a just state. This was part 1 of the lecture. We will now have a 3 minutes break, and you can send in your questions via email or via the chat. See you within 3 minutes. Welcome back.
Oh, Joop, there are some questions.
Yes.
I first read a question, and already someone in the audience has responded to that. So I'll give the response right away with a question. First, the question. Why is too much freedom not good, according to Plato? And what does he mean by having an image of the good within yourself? Then the reaction on that is too much freedom. Whilst the law is not written in the heats of the population, then they are dangerous by degree, whether mentally or physically, and then need laws written on paper. You still have the question?
Well, the first, so the reaction is of someone else. Do I understand it correctly?
That the reaction was of someone else on
Yeah.
too much freedom.
Yeah. So let me first start about the personal freedom, why this is a risk for the state. I mentioned the French philosopher de Tocqueville, who said that the personal freedom of individuals in the state and equality of each member of the state, each human being, they are at odds because, and that is quite easy to understand, if you have too much personal freedom, then very quickly this can go at the expense of the freedom of others. So then there is, if you do things that do harm to others or are at the expense of other people in society, then there is no equality anymore. So that is why they already saw, and these philosophers in the 18th century saw that already during their lifetime, that these two are at odds with each other. So that you can say that they realized already then that self-control and not an unlimited and insatiable personal freedom to exercise that in society is something that you cannot have in a democracy. Everyone needs to have some self-control and discipline in order not to harm the interests of other people. So that is part 1 of the question.
And the second part of the question was, and what does he mean by having an image of the good within yourself?
Yeah, well, I said that the idea that Plato states in his dialogues and also in his philosophy, that there is something that is far beyond all comprehension, and that is what I mentioned in the first lecture some weeks ago as the boundless life, the boundless principle. And Plato gives this the name of the good. And what we also stated then is that the essential part of every living entity is, in fact, this boundless life. So in essence, we are the boundless, and we are in our evolution during the many lives that we live, we are slowly and gradually involving all the potential that we have in our inner being. But in essence, these faculties that we have in our inner being are limitless, and they are in fact identical to the boundless life, which forms the essence of the core of our being. So that is why I said, that is why Plato says, try to imagine the boundless or the good in yourself, although this is difficult to realize, but nevertheless, if you do that, you will prevent that you will put limits to your own understanding and ability to comprehend the deeper meaning of things. So it prevents that you become how do you call that, dogmatic in your way of thinking, because then you start, if you are dogmatic, you start with prejudice, looking at things without having an open mindset.
Yeah.
So that was, I think, the explanation of that part.
Okay, thanks. Was clear to me. The next question in the chat is how to deal with the situation when trias politica is under heavy pressure.
Yeah, well, we have seen that during the last couple of years that the trias politica is indeed under pressure when, for instance, independent the independence of judicial courts is at stake. We had that, for instance, for some time in a European country like Poland or Hungary. Some other countries also are shifting towards that. So if things are made, the if these independent powers like legislation or justice is made a playable of the political leaders, then the independence of legal courts is at stake. And what to do about that? That is to resist against this. And you have seen that also in Poland, for instance, there were many judges who didn't want to be politicized by the political leaders, and they wanted to be independent judges according to the current um, legislation. And if a lot of people think about this independently and support this type of, let's say, interference by political leaders, then you have a big chance when a lot of people in society see it as a threat that this can be avoided. But sometimes, it is a step-by-step sneaky process that brings you gradually, step-by-step, to a situation where also judicial courts become the the playground of political behavior of political leaders. And the same is the case for instance, for what I call the fourth power, the independence of media, the newspapers, but also online media. If they are not able to bring independent news so that the citizens of a country can form their own judgment and their own opinions based on as good as information as possible from a journalistic point of view, then if that comes under pressure, because also here politicians trying to get their hands into the media, and we have seen that in the past also all around the world, that the media are not having the space anymore to be independent, then also you see things going down. And the same happened before World War II. The first thing that in Italy and in Germany, what the political leaders did, so Mussolini and also Hitler, was to declare that the the independent press were liars and that you could not trust their analysis anymore. So then everything becomes, let's say, uncertain what is true and what is not true. And also here, the whole population of a country must try to hold on to the right to have independent journalism and independent news in order to be able to make their own, to form their own opinions. And well, this is actually also, for instance, the parliament. You should also try to keep the balance in who is in power in the parliament, because then they are the ones in principle who make the new laws. So there also you should try to keep a healthy balance in let's say the majority who is in power and is actually taking responsibility for the executive power, the government, but also that, let's say, the parties who are not forming the majority, the minority, that they also can have their say in the actual governance of the country. This all should be can be kept safe by guaranteeing that everybody can express himself, all citizens, all groups in society, and they are not crushed down by a political group that doesn't want any opposition.
Yeah.
So the responsibility is there for all the citizens in the country to not let it happen that one group takes control and power and everybody has to keep his mouth shut.
I now first have two questions that came in by mail, and then I have one more statement in the chat.
Yeah.
The first question in the mail is justice the same as restoring harmony?
Sorry, what?
Is justice the same as restoring harmony?
Well, that is difficult to, in general terms, that justice means that everyone is treated equally. That is the principle of equality in a democratic state. That, like we have in the Netherlands, we have that the basic legislation of the Netherlands is that article number 1 is that everyone is treated equally, regardless of sex, religion, all these aspects. So justice is when everyone is equally treated and has the same rights as everyone else. That does not mean that if justice is applied via the judges, so to speak, that this always is a guarantee that harmony follows out of this. And to give you some, it is a little bit a detailed example, but in the first lecture I gave as an example of another type of governments that has been established in countries of Southern Africa based on the Ubuntu tradition, that here we have legislation where if you are accused of something and you are convicted of something and sent to prison, for instance, that this is more a legislation where you, how do you say it? I'm looking for the word of how do you say that? It is not that harmony is restored. No, you are also punished because you did something to someone else. So it is a system of punishment. While in the Ubuntu philosophy, the main thing is to restore harmony again, so that there you have to do to cooperate in order to restore the harmony between the perpetrator and the victim. And that is another type of thinking. So this distinction, with this in mind, this example, you can say that if there is justice by the rule of law, it does not always mean that harmony is restored. I hope this has given a little bit some clarification how you can look at this.
To me, it does. Maybe the person who asked the question can ask a deeper question if he's got more.
Yeah.
Then the other question in the mail is you talked about the definition of justice from Plato.
Yeah.
And that it's in a state is it which everyone fulfills the duty or task for which he is naturally most suited.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the question is, but who determines that what task is most suited?
Yeah. Yeah. That of course is something that is very individually determined, and I mean with that everyone should be helped to learn to recognize what his talents are. And that sounds very easy, but it's not so easy, we know in practice, to know what are your talents. Sometimes people have many interests and affinities, but what the biggest talent of them is sometimes difficult because people cannot choose or they are not interested to find this out. But if you raise children from an early age in the proper way, then if they are guided properly, then both the people who guide the children and the children themselves will be able to find out what their affinities, what their characteristics, and what their talents are. They should be part of the education to find out what their talents are. So they will be able to recognize themselves, but also the people who guide them. And that is a matter of education, to let come out what is already in the inner part of the children present.
Yeah, and I think that's because there was more a statement in the chat that said, I think that teaching ethics, virtues, and morals in school would be a great idea.
Yeah.
Perhaps replace the Bible in some US schools with some Tibetan Buddhist style guidelines for righteous living. So it's not really a question, but a statement. But
Yeah.
maybe you can reflect on that.
Yeah. 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 I think that already from let's say from a very small age till let's say to adulthood, it is important that children are taught what ethics is, and of course it starts with simple rules like playing together is sharing together your toys.
Yeah.
If you're still a small child, and that this will be developed and part of the curriculum, but also the total educational atmosphere in which children are raised, that they learn to cooperate, learn respect towards each other, and that the ethics and morale is already from a very small age part of their, let's say, the development of their consciousness, and that it should play a much more bigger role than usually at present in most schooling systems is present. And you can do that in all kinds of ways. So playing together and sharing together, but all kinds of forms of cooperation, that the children help each other, and that they also learn what respect is in the most simple terms of the word. and that they see that as something that is so natural, and that behavior like bullying and so on is something that should not take place, and that they think it is natural to help each other. So a very social way of living together. And that is also what Plato said: recognizing your own talents and being helped by others to develop those talents is one thing. But the other thing is that that children are learned from a very young age that is also natural to put your talents at service to the whole group. And that means that they learn that it is natural not to just live for yourself, but to use your talents to help others, or to bring it in, to bring the whole group further in their development stages.
Yeah, yeah. And then I have a last also statement, more maybe something to reflect
Yeah.
upon again. Do away with profit and industry, and
Hmm.
there will not be any thieves. And that the writer says it's written by Lao Tse.
Yeah, yeah. Very good statement. I fully agree with that. I will later in this lecture, I will give an example of companies who are not having profit as their main raison d'être, their main purpose for existence. So I will give this example, and from the example it will be clear that I fully agree with that. So, okay, thank you very much for all your good questions. We will continue now with part 2 of the lecture. And we are going to have a look at the ideal state according to Plato. Plato describes 3 groups for the ideal state: the wise men, the guardians, and the workers, each with their own function. The wise men are the ones who lead the state and must also ensure the continuity of what must be leading, wisdom. That is why they also provide education and can select future leaders on the basis of wisdom. And they can do that because they are wise themselves. The requirements are tough. The most important virtue of future leaders is wisdom. And Plato describes an entire educational process that can take up to 50 years, 50. One of the most important criteria for selecting leading figures is that these people will never actually say themselves that they want to lead the state. They will always find that there must certainly be people who are even wiser than they are. They start from the idea of the good, but will say that they don't have the wisdom to arrive at a harmonious world. Therefore, they will have to be forced to lead the state. Then you have the second group, the guardians. They have to watch over the state and protect it. Like the wise men, they have no possessions. The wise men and the guardians are said to have already risen above material desires. They are satisfied with the least they need, just shelter and food. Their main virtue is courage. And finally, the workers. They are the ones who maintain the state and also make sure that the wise men and the watchers have shelter and food. They have the most property and may divide it among themselves. Their most important virtue is self-control. With these different functions in the ideal state, various virtues are discussed in this dialogue. But ultimately, based on the metaphor of the state, they are looking for what justice is, another very important virtue. With the description of the ideal state, in which all people are at the service of the state, Plato concludes that justice, harmony, arises when everyone fulfills their function for the benefit of the whole, and everyone exactly does what they are best able to do, which we just discussed during our questions. And wisdom is then, according to Plato, doing that which at the right moment brings harmony. The wise men who lead the state must therefore always look for connections with other people in order to realize that harmony. And that reflects very well what the function of the leader is. In this dialogue, the partners of Socrates say, "But this is really a very Spartan state. Those wise men have a lot of responsibility, but are not allowed to do anything at all. Are you going to find those people?" And Socrates then gives two answers. First, that promoting the well-being of everyone is paramount. Of course, the wise must also contribute to this and sacrifice something. Second, that the sacrifice for the true wise man is very relative, because he has long since stopped finding his happiness in a big house or in many possessions. I would like to give another example of a wise leader who comes close to what Plato describes. It is the example of Vaclav Havel. Vaclav Havel was a Czech writer, dissident and politician. Havel was one of the founders of the human rights movement Charta 77 in Czechoslovakia in 1977. Between 1970 and 1989, he was imprisoned 3 times, sometimes in complete isolation, and spent a total of 5 years in captivity. Havel's prominent role in Czech history was leading the Velvet Revolution of 1989. The communist state collapsed after the non-violent uprising. Havel's moral strength and manner of speaking inspired the people and helped the revolution to succeed. He was subsequently elected by parliament as president of Czechoslovakia. He led the country through the difficult transition from a totalitarian regime to democracy. His leadership promoted democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Havel's strong morals and belief in social responsibility characterized his administration. He advocated political reconciliation and public trust. Havel promoted human rights and democracy worldwide, outside of Czech politics. As an example of his way of thinking, I now want to give a short quote, which I think really characterizes Havel as an inspiring man and leader. Quote, "Consciousness precedes being, and not the other way around, as the Marxists claim. For this reason, the salvation of this human world lies nowhere else than in the human heart, in the human power to reflect, in human meekness and human's responsibility." Unquote. If we realize that ideas rule the world and we form an image of an ideal state, the next question is, how do we let that ideal of wisdom and justice rule in the state? We return again to Plato, who in a later period wrote a second interesting sketch about the state in the dialogue The Statesman, the Politician. In it he describes 7 forms of government and the extent to which the laws are respected. In the highest form of government, he sees a society that needs no laws, with the king philosopher in charge. Everyone adheres to his highest ideal, acts with honor and conscience, and as correctly as possible. The law, with capitals, or the whole of natural laws, rules. People think and live from the unity of all that exists. No laws are needed to prevent people from breaking rules. To speak with Lao Tse, when Tao disappears, that is, insight in the unity of life, then justice arises. That is to say, only then are laws needed. The second form of government, like the first, has a leader, a king, but he adheres to the ordinary laws of the country. You could call him an enlightened autocrat. Last lecture we mentioned King Ashoka of India from the 3rd century BC, who is a good example of this. In our time we see examples of wise leaders such as Gandhi, Mandela and Havel. The third form that Plato mentions is the aristocracy, a small group of people who are leaders in the state and abide by the laws. Then follow in succession the fourth form, democracy, in which people do adhere to the laws of the country. Up to this point, the hierarchy is based on authority and on the law or the laws of the country. Then follow forms in which the laws are no longer respected and the hierarchy is based on the exercise of power. Like the fifth form, democracy, in which people no longer adhere to the laws. The latter is a lot better than the sixth, the oligarchy, which again gives leadership to a small group, which does not adhere to the laws. Finally, there is tyranny, led by one person who does not adhere to the laws and only acts to stay in power. In our own democratic society, examples can be recognized that extend approximately from the second to the seventh form, because both the selfless and the selfish motive are expressed in man. The second and third forms can be seen occasionally in the business world, for example, where more and more companies are not about profit. And we talked about it during the questions in the first break. But these companies are founded based on an ideal of one or more of the founders. They simply want to make the best possible product or provide a service to society. A very good example of thinking in the direction of unity and justice is the concept in commercial business that is indicated by the term steward-owned companies. In such companies, it is not the shareholders who have the say, but the stewards who watch over the company also for the next generation. In steward-owned companies, shareholders have a serving role. They cannot decide to sell the company to the highest economic bidder. That say lies with the stewards. The role of the stewards is to guard the mission of the company. That is why they can more easily implement a social and sustainable policy focused on the long term. An example is the clothing manufacturer Patagonia that transferred its shares to a foundation that aims to combat climate change. Another example is the Efteling, well known in the Netherlands as an attraction park for kids. In the Netherlands, more than 100 companies are currently steward-owned. The lower organizational forms that do not comply with the law can be found, for example, in companies that try to find loopholes in the law in order to pay, for instance, as little tax as possible. On paper, they may comply with the law, but to what extent there is still justice is a very good question. In addition to the starting point of the unity of all that exists, Plato finally formulates a number of criteria for the leadership of an ideal state, namely, always tell the truth and never use violence. Be just. Inspire people, because just policy cannot be enforced. Have insight into the imperishable core of man. Inspire a team of reliable co-workers who also have wisdom as main characteristic. In fact, Plato thus arrives again at the aristocracy structure. Examples of leading figures with a certain great ideal, we already mentioned Gandhi, Mandela and Havel, with a group of trusted co-workers around them who share that ideal. They are co-workers who never work for themselves, but in turn pass on the ideal they pursue. We also see this with all teachers. World teachers, like Gautama the Buddha, had his students. Jesus had his disciples. Plato was one of the students of Socrates and in turn also had students. They always pass on wisdom in this way. A present-day example, in Dutch called Buurtzorg. We see this example in various forms. Organizations of companies that give as much responsibility as possible to their employees to enable them to do what they are good at. The example Buurtzorg is a large healthcare organization in the Netherlands. It is healthcare in the neighborhood, which works on the basis of self-managing teams of district nurses and nursing assistants. These are responsible for the planning and execution of the work. They arrange everything themselves. They ask each other for feedback, and they also distribute the salaries themselves. And ultimately, it is, as strange as it may sound, a hierarchical organization with regional coaches and a small head office. A hierarchy based on suitability and knowledge. But this is certainly not possible without a certain degree of trust with people who demonstrate natural leadership based on mental and spiritual qualities. So far, this example. This is the end of part 2 of the lecture. We will now have again a break of 3 minutes and see you after the break. Welcome back. Mariska.
Yeah, well, we have 2 questions, but I think the first one you already answered because it became during the lecture. It was, can you give some more characteristics of a wise man?
Yeah.
And shortly after you came with a list.
Yeah.
So I presume we can see that as answered. Otherwise, we might have more from that person. And the other question in the chat is, Plato states to always tell the truth. But isn't it sometimes better to remain silent?
Well, always telling the truth can also, of course, include to remain silent if it is wiser not to speak, but not to spread lies. Huh? So you sometimes can say the things that you want to share, and that has to be the truth. But you can also, let's say, keep things silent because it is not a wise idea to communicate certain ideas at that moment, but maybe at a later moment. So it can sometimes be wise not to speak and to remain silent and communicate things at a later moment when it is more the proper moment.
Yeah. Clear answer, I think. There came another question. Does a leader always get the nation they deserve?
Gets that?
Well, it's the people get the leader they deserve.
Yeah.
But now it's the other way around. Does a leader always get the nation they deserve?
Ah, well, I think the leader becomes the leader if he is if he has support in the nation where he becomes the leader. So it is not it doesn't work like this, that there is a place on earth where a group of potential leader is coming together and for who is decided what country are going are you going to lead. So um, I think it always should have the support of the people that a leader becomes the leader of a nation. And I think that is in most cases is that the practice.
Yeah, in a democracy it should, but maybe in a tyranny it might be different.
Yeah. But then let's say that there should always be in the most natural case that there is a correspondence between the characteristics of the leader and the major characteristic or the average characteristic or the average mentality of the people of a nation. And that goes then, that refers to this statement that the people get the leader they deserve, that there is a correspondence between these two characteristics. So if people are not taking their responsibilities and are taking things easily, they should not be surprised to get a leader that is a little bit authoritarian because when they are not really living very consciously and contributing to the state, then they run the risk that they get a leader that is going to tell them what to do. So,
Yeah. Those were the question for the second
yeah.
part, Joop.
Okay, thank you for all the questions. We go finally to part 3, a wise democracy. And the question, of course, is a wise democracy possible? And the answer is yes, indeed. Even in our current democratic system, wise action can be taken. We all now live in a modern democratic system. Most of us realize that we lack the overall picture to properly resolve all current affairs and problems. That is why it seems that the best thing we can do is to have ourselves represented by people who do have sufficient knowledge and insight. But that should be done from the point of view of the general interest, at least viewed from the country as a unity. Then there is no room for party discipline or coalition formation, which means that only part of society is included in the decision-making process and people no longer recognize their representative. Because only when the entire state, with all its problems, is taken into account, there can be proper balance. Otherwise, this will lead to all kinds of tensions and protests, and the justified feeling that one is not being heard and that one no longer matters. Another important point is that there is always the risk that citizens have not been given sufficient opportunity to understand why certain laws or measures are good to implement. Sufficient attention to consultation with citizens in order to create support, if possible based on consensus, is therefore also essential. In his messages to conventions, Godfried de Prucker writes that the true leader in a democracy certainly has an eye and ear for what is happening in the state at every level. He will always take this knowledge into account in his decisions when leading that democratic society. However, if you look around you, you will see that such a pure democracy, which the Prucker talks about, is currently not to be found. So once again, briefly summarized, and last lecture we showed a more extensive list of 12 criteria that the wise men, you could call them universal politicians, should meet, assuming the unity of all that exists, speaking the truth and never use violence or coercion, be just, capable of informing, connecting and inspiring people, and having insight into the imperishable part of man. You can further refine and supplement this list yourself, and especially try to meet the requirements yourself. And virtually no one will be able to meet all the requirements. Then, of course, we also need to pause for a moment to consider the wisdom of the citizens, of the people of a country. And here again, at the level of the individual citizen, the following applies. Everyone who has developed some wisdom and understanding in themselves can recognize this in another man whom you experience as a relatively wise person. In short, we don't have to be perfectly wise to be able to function wisely in society, because we consciously can listen to people who understand more than we do. At the level of groups of citizens, or the entire population of a country, you can see that they are attracted to each other on the basis of similarity in characteristic and existing karmic ties. That each population group has its own character, everyone can recognize that around him. What that unique character of a population group is something to think about carefully. Because something like the national feeling is often something of an emotional, vital nature, and is almost never a good basis for the wise governance of a country. Because in matters like the governance of a country, it is often about issues that have to do with morality, with ethical issues. And that is where the individual responsibility of each citizen comes into play again. Because for the individual person, it is true that he often stands much higher in his ideals and morality than this national feeling. Summarizing, the people contribute significantly to whether a wise democracy takes shape. If citizens have developed the wisdom within themselves to choose wise leaders who stand above the parties. If every citizen feels co-responsible for the government of the country and helps to safeguard morality based on his ideals. And citizens are involved based on their knowledge, insight and wisdom to think and act together, if possible on the basis of consensus. In discussing the different forms of government, it has emerged that, according to Plato, the spiritual hierarchical structure, the aristocracy form, is the most suitable form. The question now is, does leadership by wise men, a hierarchical way of leadership, stand in the way of a democratic structural form? We will now briefly examine this. If we look at the daily practice, we sometimes see democratically elected leaders who behave like dictators, and appointed or natural leaders who operate very democratically. Because what wise leader would not listen to the real needs of his people and try to fulfill these needs? So it is about the combination of hierarchy and democracy. Does this go together, and does this lead to a wise democracy? Analysis. What is the basis on which a hierarchy can function? A hierarchy cannot exist without delegation of authority from the top to the bottom. In a hierarchy, each individual is a constituent part of that hierarchy, but also has his own individual function and is responsible for it as an individual. What is the basis on which a democracy can function? If a democracy were not based on the principle of delegated responsibility, that means to have a mandate in each of its components, it would simply be an anarchy and become chaos. The democratic form of government involves, just like with the hierarchy, accountability to others, and then usually to those above us in an ever-increasing series, but also to those who have given the mandate, such as, for example, the voter in a democracy. And I will mention it again. A special case of democracy is where the views of all those involved are actually taken into account as much as possible. So not on the basis of most votes count, but on the basis of consensus, where everyone adheres to the decision taken. In conclusion, we can say there is no essential difference between the hierarchical and democratic form of government, other than perhaps in the structural form. Every organization, with its fundamental principle of government, must be based on the greatest possible freedom for each individual member to develop his talents, with the associated individual responsibility and duty to contribute his talents for the benefit of the whole. After all, Only in this way a well-functioning hierarchy can take shape. We could describe this all in an abstract way as follows. From the wisest at the top, the flow of wisdom can flow down to the various layers in society without many obstacles. This requires that every person stimulates to let the wisdom flow down within himself. Everyone forms a link in that hierarchy. Everyone is a co-worker and a leader, is a student and a teacher within his own sphere. To achieve this, again, according to Plato, everyone is given the opportunity to develop what suits him. Everyone fulfills the tasks that suits him, and thus contributes to what is needed for the whole of the state. I will give you now at the end of this lecture 2 examples of wisdom in a democracy. The first is the example of the Iroquois, the first Indian inhabitants of Canada. The Iroquois, a league of 5 people in India, which lasted for at least 400 years. Their cooperation was intended to be able to act together in attack and defense. The highest body of the league was the General Council, consisting of 50 leaders, comparable to Plato's guardians. It is an intermediate form between real aristocracy, where the wisest rules, and pure democracy. These Iroquois leaders must have shown that they possess a number of ethical qualities: patience, balanced judgment, dedication to the general interest. Then there is also a hierarchy in the female line. The female leaders nominate the new leaders as candidates, and the decisions in the council were always taken by consensus. The second example is that of sociocracy. Sociocracy, from the Latin socius, meaning companion or colleague, and the Greek kratein, to rule or govern. This is a sociocracy is a political philosophy for a form of government that assumes cooperation in decision-making by people at all levels of an organization or society. Literally translated is it government by cooperation. This is expressed in the so-called consent principle, the principle that a decision can only be made if none of those present has a reasoned objection to making that decision. In this, it deviates from the democratic principle of one person, one vote. A similar sociocratic governance model is applied by an electrical engineering company in Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This company has about 100 people, and it works on these principles. In order to apply this form of decision-making with larger groups of people, a circle organization is added to the existing hierarchy, in which the lower circles are represented in the higher circles. In all circles, the following always applies. Decision-making is based on consent. An important precondition for making equal decision is the openness of the atmosphere and the openness of sharing of information. Employees have in this way much say and decide together on what is done, why and how. Also, profits are reinvested in the company and in the skills of the employees. Finally, I would like to conclude this lecture with paradox number 17 of the Tao Te Ching, written by Lao Tse. It is about wise men and the people. It runs as follows. The great rulers, they are not noticed by the people. The lesser ones, they follow and praise. The lower ones, they fear. The still lower ones, they despise. Therefore, the wise man who wants to stand above the people must remain below them in words. In order to go before them, he must remain behind them as a person. Thus, the people do not feel his burden if he stands above them. This was the end of part 3. We will now have again a 3 minutes break. Welcome back.
There are two questions at this moment, Joop.
Mm-hmm.
And the first question is, why do we not always recognize wise men?
Well, that I think we have then to look at ourselves because first, of course, we have to develop the wisdom in ourselves to be able to identify them, to identify the wisdom in other people. And that is one very important aspect. And the second thing is that we should together as citizens of a country create an atmosphere where we actually create the possibilities for wise leaders to come from the background of society into the spotlights of society. And I will give you a practical example of this. There are examples across the world where people are in fact wise leaders, but during the circumstances where there are a lot of, let's say, people striving for power, they do not have the favorable conditions to be recognized as a wise leader and get the position as a wise leader, because other people are overruling them or are, shouting louder, so to speak. But if the citizens develop in themselves the wish for really a wise leader strongly enough, then an atmosphere is created where such a wise leader will, and if he is invited to become the wise leader, then he may say yes. And I have a very up-to-date example of that. In 1970, East Pakistan became the independent nation of Bangladesh. Up till then, it was the eastern part of Pakistan. And after the revolution, they became independent. And already in these beginning years, there was a man called Muhammad Yunus. He was professionally, he was a banker. And he already in the beginning years, in the 70s, introduced a way of governance for small villages that was very effective and also based on democratic principles. He further helped the people in Bangladesh by developing the so-called microcredit with his Grameen Bank, for which he and the Grameen Bank got in 2004 the Nobel Peace Prize. And the characteristics of this microcredit was that especially women can get microcredits because as a group of people they ask the bank to give this credit, and as a group of people, so cooperating with each other, they also give the guarantee that they pay the loan back to the bank. And this has worked very good in a country like Bangladesh because it has given especially women, also men, but it was especially focused on women, to give them their own responsibility and grip on their own lives to rise above poverty, which you have a lot in those countries. And Muhammad Yunus has always been active in this field to support the people bottom up to have a life they can live themselves and take their own responsibility. Now, some of you may have followed the news, and there has been from 1970 to 2024, there have been on and off the change of power between two main parties in Bangladesh. And recently, the prime minister was kicked out by student protests because she had adopted a certain very discriminatory piece of legislation that many people opposed very much. So she was more or less kicked out of the country. And then the people were so sick and tired of all this polarization during decades that they asked this Muhammad Yunus, who had proven to be, let's say, above parties and also always had helped people bottom up to live a better life, that he was asked to become temporarily Prime Minister of Bangladesh. He's 84 years old, so he has not so long to live anymore.
Yeah.
So he has no personal interests anymore. But so he was given, he was asked to become the leader of the country. And he is for me a very good example for someone who has proven to be the wise leader and has the right ethics and morale. And he this time he was asked to come out of the background of the country and to take over the initiative to form a government and to restore peace and harmony again in the country. And hopefully he will succeed. So yes, sometimes there is time needed and the, let's say, the awareness of the people that they need wise leaders that are focused on connection, on trying to cooperate between different groups instead of polarizing to stay in power. And that example, I think, exists, and there are more examples, but this is a very recent one, only since a few months.
Yeah, and a good one. Thank you. Another question in the mail is, when people respond in a personal way to given opportunities for self-development, this opportunity expires. I think of the home care organization that gave teams their own responsibility, low down in the organization. This resulted in competition between teams. Soon a group of managers was appointed and no one had any say anymore.
But that is then this is a not very wise development that took place. So actually it is a development that goes downwards instead of that it is maintaining a wise way of governing the organization. And that is a very much a pity. And one way or another, this is also, of course, the responsibility of all people, all co-workers involved, that this could happen. And this is always a difficult situation because all people have to be able to speak out what they think that should happen. And if that is not really possible anymore, and you get these different factions and competition, then it's sliding downwards, and you have to start all over again. And yeah, it's a pity
Yeah,
that this happened.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And then the last question I have at the moment, you talked about how wisdom rules in a democracy. You gave some of the examples, but nowadays, probably most important principle are the economic principles in the society, with profit, efficiency, and still going on. It is changing, but it's still going on. And there is a lot of fear of bankruptcy, not having enough money to feed yourself or buy a house. And is it also possible to do something about that fear?
Yeah, well, the very, very concrete question. I'm very glad with that question. Of course, fear is something that we have to look at ourselves. And of course, if you have already a house and a stable situation, then it is easy to have ideas about it. But if you don't have that and are still young and you still have to make it in life, so to speak, then it is a very complex situation. How you can do something about the fact that everything is going back to economics and to profits and thinking and so on. While there has also been eras, like for instance after the Second World War, everything was built up again in all the countries in the world, and it was quite normal that the management of companies was also looking after where people could live, so they built houses for their co-workers, and it was more uh, organized in a social way, like we also had and still have social housing corporations, where houses are built for people with not so high salaries, but with an affordable rent per month. And that, you see, in many countries has been converted into the money-making principles, uh, is is the guiding principle now, and not anymore what can we do to give everybody the plain right to have a roof over his head. And I think we have to start thinking together again about what are the basic rights of every citizen of a country, and what should become something that is not dominated by profit or loss thinking, so economic thinking, but what is the more social type of considerations that you have. How can we arrange that housing, sanitation, water, energy, healthcare, education, all these basic things that every citizen needs from the stage of a baby till he is an old retired person, that all these things should not be governed by economic or profit principles, but should be something that is of a general interest principle. And that should be, we should look again, what should be our standard. There are already countries where housing is organized in a much better way, where you cannot own a house anymore, but you pay a reasonable amount for rent. Or also countries where you get a basic income, so that you always have, whether you have a paid job or not, whether you do volunteering work or not, you always have a basic income that is a livable income, where you have the access to payable housing and food and sanitation and healthcare and so on. So the general interest and the interest of all citizens of a country, and everybody needs to be treated equally. That is something that should be more in focus, and it does not mean that you have to abandon all principles of efficiency or well, economic principles, but you can look at it in a different way and not only have companies that work for the shareholders' profit, which is the case most of the time now in society.
Yeah.
So I think going back to the basics and see what the general interest is for all citizens of a country, that is the standard and the eye with which we should look at solving the problems nowadays.
Well, thank you for your answers, Joop. These were the questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Mariska, and all questionnaires. Thank you for all the questions. It helps very much to clarify a number of things some more. We will continue next week with the study on this lecture, and I invite you all to participate in this study. During the week there will be a very short reader also distributed, and shortly before the study some questions which will be the agenda for the study will also be sent to you. So hopefully we'll see each other next week Sunday during the study, and we can continue about the subject, very important subject, some more during Sunday evening, 12th of January. I'm going to close the lecture now with the Gayatri of the Rig Veda, and it runs as follows. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds so that we, recognizing our oneness with divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.